about planning, reasoning, and collaborating with all kinds of AI systems. Now, the series features prominent researchers and practitioners whose work has had a meaningful impact and made different kinds of contributions across these fields. And we've had excellent talks already in this edition from the likes of Zana Bushina, who's kicked off the series, speaking on worker-centric AI. We then had Anna Kawakami, who spoke to us about designing positive AI futures for complex work. Adita Boguka from Nokia Bell Labs spoke about visual tools for understanding AI's impact. We had Harman Preet Kaur, who spoke about cognitive scaffolding in the age of AI. JC Reese Antis discussed HCI in this transformative age of AI. Nadine Schlicker spoke about their new trustworthiness assessment model. And more recently, we had Hua Shen, who spoke about bidirectional human AI alignment. And the very last talk was Agathe Balin, who spoke about connecting empirical insights on AI development and use to AI governance. So furthering along this very lively conversation around these topics, today it's my pleasure to welcome the wonderful Asha Biega to share more perspectives around the promise and perils, as she put it, of consent credit compensation in generative AI. Now, Dr. Asha Biega is a computer scientist and a tenure-track faculty member at the Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy, where she leads the interdisciplinary Responsible Computing Group. Her research explores the intersection of computing and society with a focus on tech and governance and regulation, social responsibility, as well as digital well-being. So she's a wonderful person to have many of these conversations about. She's a principal investigator in the CASA Cluster of Excellence and the Find HR Consortium, and has collaborated widely across disciplines and sectors. She's also served as an expert external member for the EU and the general co-chair of FACT 2025, which is the biggest academic conference focusing on the societal impacts of computing. She now sits in the FACT Executive Committee. Her work has been Rodota Award for Innovative Research and Data Protection, Annual Privacy Forum's Best Paper Award, SAT-ML Notable Reviewer Award, and the GI DBIS Dissertation Award of the German Informatics Society. She's also been named as one of the 2025 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics. I'm sure I can keep singing more, praises of her very illustrious career already, but I'd rather pass this baton to Asha so we can hear more about her work and insights that she'd like to share with us. Asha, once again, thank you so much for being here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I just want to confirm if you can see my screen. Perfect. My team and I work on different questions at the intersection of computing and society, in particular thinking about questions of technology governance. And we approach these questions from the belief that effective governance requires thinking about three different elements. The normative, that is the policies, regulations, norms, and values. The computational, thinking about concrete implementations, metrics, algorithms, and the human factors, because users ultimately are the ones interacting, producing contents for the systems we think about. And in today's talk, I'm going to focus on how we can approach governance of data in the context of generative AI. And in particular, thinking about this framework, which has recently emerged, focusing on the three principles of consent, credit, and compensation. Why do we need to do this work? Why do we need to think about governance in AI, and in particular as it relates to governance of the training data? Creative workers, since the emergence of generative AI, have experienced significant career-based harms. And the central issue that contributed to those harms is that generative AI models are trained on creative works without the author's permission, without proper guardrails, or without appropriate governance strategies. Creators are not happy. There have been many lawsuits in the recent weeks, months, and years. Some of the most prominent are the lawsuit between New York Times and OpenAI, the Copilot class action, or the recent strike that the Screen Actors Guild and American Radio Artists and Writers Guild went on to try to protest against exploitation of the work for training of generative AI. So creators are not happy, and what can we do about it? We can perhaps approach this from a variety of different angles, but we can try to come up with effective governance frameworks. One of the frameworks which can be considered is the 3C framework. It's the framework authored by Monika Botta-Moising in 2017, originally applied in the context of protection of indigenous communities and creators and the intellectual property of those creators. The consent proposes three different principles. The framework proposes three different principles. The first principle is consent, which means that we should give creators the opportunity to provide freely given and informed permission when their work is being used or intended to be used in generative AI. The principle of credit means that we should provide explicit acknowledgement of creative workers' contributions in the context of AI models. And compensation means that we should provide monetary or non-monetary reimbursement for use of creative works in AI training. In this talk, I'm going to start by presenting a study we published recently, which focused on the nuanced role of this 3C framework in generative AI governance. I am then going to focus on one particular aspect, consent, and try to figure out what we can learn about application of consent to generative AI from another area where consent has been studied now for many, many years, and that is GDPR and the protection of personal data. And then because of what emerges from our study on the 3C framework, but also based on our experiences and perhaps frustrations with consent and its implementation in the GDPR, I'm going to talk about the study, which it will appear in CHI this year, where we use speculative design to propose how we could collectively govern consent through citizen assemblies. All right, so let's start with that first study investigating the 3C frameworks. There were three research questions that guided our investigation. The first one was whether the 3Cs can serve as a useful framework for generative AI governance in the context of creative work. The second question is what creative workers need and want from AI governance to address potential harms to their careers. And what disruptions to creative work cannot be addressed through governance alone. So some of these frameworks we're thinking about might not be enough to address them. For this study, we conducted 20 semi-structured interviews with creative professionals. We tried to diversify it across several domains. We had 7 participants with a background in visual art and design, 6 professionally active in writing, and 7 programmers. We try to balance our participant pool between people who are company employees and those who are freelancers. And our sample was relatively well balanced across the dimension of gender, skewed towards the younger population, and included professionals with an approximate professional experience of 5 years, 5.2 years. There is one finding that I can share upfront, and that is that the implementation of this framework is quite nuanced, and each of the Cs has the potential to both protect and harm creators, depending on how exactly it is implemented. So let me try to now dive into the 3 dimensions and our findings. We found that most creators want informed consent. They mentioned that they, in particular, would require clear information about how their work will be used, what are the retention periods for the work and for the outputs that are generated based on their work, and about any future applications their work might contribute to. But we also found that there are several issues with consent in the context of governance, and that is that consent decisions will necessarily have to change over time, because as AI advances, what is acceptable today might become harmful tomorrow. So many participants in our study, well, that was back in 2024, AI has advanced quite a bit since then, but back then they felt that the AI wasn't good enough to really harm them, but they felt that this might change in the future. So even if they gave consent at that particular time for the work to be used by AI, they might not think the same way further down the road. We also found that power dynamics complicate consent. Workers might be coerced to agree, either due to job insecurity or because of their contractual obligations. And so some participants in our study questioned whether consent as a guiding principle can be meaningfully used for governance. When it comes to credit, we found that some participants indeed wanted attribution. And one of the reasons they gave for this is that they felt it was important for them to build recognition and build their career. But the findings related to this principle were perhaps the most surprising for us, because a lot of participants said they would not want credit when their work is used to train AI. And there were three types of reasons that they provided. The first reason that we've heard was that they felt they were not famous enough, and that attribution in this context would not matter for any practical reasons. The second reason why creative workers felt that credit might not be necessary was when they worked for a company and the work they produced due to contractual reasons belonged to their employer anyway. And so they felt that without meaningfully changing these contracts or signing new contracts, their preferences there did not matter. And then finally, several participants expressed fear for responsibility of AI outputs that would be generated using their work or their style as a sort of guiding parameter of generating the work. And as this quote here shows, in particular, they were concerned when their work would be used in a context that they do not agree with or align with, say politically. For example, this participant said they would be really, really angry if far-right groups created images that were trained on their work or in their style. When it comes to compensation, we also found that all participants in our study wanted to be compensated in one way or another for producing input for generative AI. But the expectations regarding how that compensation might work in practice dependent on the particular context. For example, a participant said that when it comes to the work projects, that is projects that they're generating for the users or for the company that they're working for, salary is sufficient during the employment, but they might want some extra compensation if they were to leave the company, but the company would still want to reuse the creations they generated afterwards. But we found that when it comes to personal projects, money might not be enough in terms of compensation. So some participants said that they really cared about their personal projects, and because of that emotional attachments, it's really hard to think what kind of compensation might be enough for this work to be later, say, reused and regenerated in all kinds of different ways. So the specific, even though the principles are generally agreed on as good principles for guiding governance of AI, a lot will depend on the practical implementation, on the context in which they're applied, and so on and so forth. Because we also wanted to understand questions of governance beyond the specific frameworks, we aim to understand what the current gaps in the governance might be. And we found 4 types of gaps that our participants were concerned about. One was that in most organizations they worked for, there were currently no established strategies for governing AI. Policies that were being developed were often reactive rather than proactive, and sometimes resorted to simplistic solutions such as complete bans on the usage of AI within the company. Second, creative workers felt that their voices were often left out of the conversation about generative AI within companies, and very few were part of unions, which limited also their opportunity for collective advocacy for their rights. Participants also mentioned concerns about copyright, and that is both when it comes to violations of copyright of their own works, but also worries that if usage of generative AI within company is permitted, they might inadvertently violate somebody else's copyright. And fourth, we found that participants wanted good labeling strategy to be able to filter and differentiate between AI-made and human-made work. Beyond these specific gaps, it was obvious throughout the interviews that power dynamics play a role in how principles of governance are perceived, requested, and implemented. Unpredictable power shifts might occur, as I mentioned previously, in the context of changing consent over time. Similarly, power shifts, when technology develops, the way the power shifts between workers and the organizations and the providers of AI systems is unspecified and unknown at a given time. There are a lot of information asymmetries. What training data is being used is largely unknown, and workers really wanted transparency about if and when their work is being used. The lack of established rules, when missing governance leads to very reactive approaches, and creators are not being asked to provide input on those approaches, so sort of quick band-aid fixes. And finally, market precarity. So when we are in a situation with a lot of uncertainty and lack of economic opportunities, this makes meaningful participation in governance really challenging. Participants also mentioned various disruptions that they thought about that perhaps go beyond what different governance approaches might even be able to address. They did mention worrying about the general loss of respect for the craft, where, say, non-experts might believe that anybody can now be creative and create works of art without years of training. Loss of work is something that is actively being discussed in media and policy circles, and indeed this was also reflected in our interviews. In particular, this worry was highlighted by freelancers, because as this one the quote on the slide says, they did notice that since the emergence of AI, they started receiving fewer and fewer orders. Creators were worried about the lack of human thoughtfulness in the creative process, and that AI itself just cannot replicate the depth, the experience, and the problem solving of human creators. And finally, they also worried about elimination of creativity in general, and that generative AI just averages everything. And this introduces various cultural risks, for example, risk of cultural homogenization. And because creators noticed a lot of gaps in how AI is being currently governed and the band-aid solutions that are being implemented, We also saw that they started to develop some adaptive strategies to deal with the current situation. For example, they say that now it's important for them to develop a skill of better prompting and develop an expertise in crafting those prompts as a marketable skill that they can use as freelancers in the marketplace. They thought that this creates an opportunity for them to augment their skills, where they use AI to enhance their work quality while preserving that creative part of the process, their human thoughtfulness. And they thought that AI brings opportunities when it comes to increasing accessibility so that a lot more people can be creative, learn skills faster, and engage with complex topics. So these were our findings related to how creatives would want to govern the data that is being used to train generative AI in the context of the 3C framework and beyond. And in the remainder of this talk, I would like to focus in particular on one element of that framework, consent. Our study has shown that there is a need for transparent information about the different use cases, about the retention periods, and the future possible applications of AI that is trained on creator input. But there are lots of issues with consent in quickly developing technologies with emergent capabilities, and power differentials complicate the implementation of this principle. But these are not the only problems that might arise in the context of consent. And in the second part of the talk, what I'd like to do is to dive deeper into what happened with consent and diagnose consent in the context of GDPR. So GDPR has been enforced for many years now, and consent is one of the guiding principles, one of the legal bases that can be used to process personal user data. And after the many years, I think there is a consensus that consent, or at least how it's currently implemented, doesn't work. So anybody who is in the EU knows the consent pop-ups very well. There has been a lot of work that investigated deceptive designs that are being used to essentially try to nudge people towards providing companies access to all of their data. But beyond these deceptive designs, in our prior work, we have uncovered several different reasons why consent implementations are not effective. And I'm going to just very briefly discuss three of them. The first one is related to how we specify what we are even consenting to. That is the purposes for which we are collecting data. I'm going to discuss one example of different legal bases that ended up being used as a loophole to get around consent. And finally, I'm going to just give several examples of how practitioners struggle with the implementation of consent and other related legal bases. And I think these examples are going to be specific to the GDPR and the handling of personal data, but I think a lot of the lessons that we learned there will likely be applicable with what happens with consent in the context of generative AI training. The first reason why consent doesn't work that I want to highlight in this talk is related to the purposes of data processing. That is how we are framing what we are collecting data for. So the principle of purpose limitation in the GDPR says that data has to be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in a manner that is incompatible with those purposes. So purpose formulations are essentially how we describe what we need the data for and what exactly we will use in this data. And so an example of this in the consent pop-ups is the select basic ads, for instance. So are the descriptions that we're producing meaningful so that people can make a meaningful and informed decision about whether they want their data to be processed? In our prior work, we have argued that no, that is not the case, and there are many reasons why not. So as an example, we can look at how Google specifies the purposes for which they're processing user data for logged in users. So this is something that they would present to users in their account settings. They would say things like, provide our services, or maintain and improve our services, or develop new services, provide personalized services, measure performance, communicate with users, or protect Google. And as you can probably already see, there are many, many issues with purpose formulations. Just to highlight a few. Very often, purposes combine multiple unrelated functionalities. For example, they would say, provide personalized services, including content and ads. And if we know how systems that process personal data for the purpose of personalization work, we would know that content personalization and ad personalization are two separate technical functionalities in the system. And there is really no good reason why we either have to consent to both or none. And furthermore, there can be lots of cognitive biases that might play a role with how we make consent decisions in the context of such combined purposes, where, for example, if one purpose is very harmful and one is unproblematic, we might make a decision depending on which of these purposes is presented first, while ignoring the second. Sometimes purposes separate related functionalities, which introduces additional consent burden. And consent burden is an issue that has been discussed as leading to user disengagement. If we are faced with a lot of such decisions, at some point we just don't care anymore, and we just quickly want to get to the website to do whatever task we need to do. Often purposes don't describe any specific functionality. So when we say provide our services, that basically means everything that a company does. So consenting to the usage of data in this case is just not specific enough. And often purposes would lack details. For example, when we say measure performance of what, using what metrics, and for what reason. Another reason why consent doesn't work is that companies have found different loopholes for getting around the requirements of consent. And one example is the usage of the legal basis of legitimate interest. Right? When you see these consent pop-ups, sometimes you would see two separate toggles. We run a user study trying to understand what are the practices related to the implementation of this legal basis. And we among other things, found that when asked when people would be comfortable with the usage of the legitimate interest legal basis, which essentially provides companies the opportunity to use user data without explicitly asking for consent, they said that those would be okay if we process data for the benefit of the users or the society, but not when it benefits a company or third-party providers. And through the study, we were able to uncover systemic loophole that enabled companies to collect a lot of data without user consent. And we showed that legitimate interest could help ease consent burden, but for purposes that are at odds with the very definition of this legal basis, because the legal basis of legitimate interest specifies these are the legitimate interests of the company or the third parties. And interestingly, in particular in the context of the training of generative AI, the recent European Union's digital omnibus package, which proposes a set of different changes to European regulations, proposes that legitimate interest can be now used as a default legal basis for the training of AI, which means that we wouldn't have to ask for consent. And finally, another reason why implementations of consent are difficult or not effective is that we as practitioners often struggle with the implementation of regulatory requirements. And there is always a gap between the abstract principles and how they can be implemented in code. So for instance, we have run a user study where we try to look at the role of online forums in online compliance to try to see what are the kinds of things developers struggle when you try to implement GDPR compliant systems. And indeed, the questions of when to use consent and when to use legitimate interest was one of the key questions that we found. And we found that people across different roles throughout organizations struggled to understand what the requirements are exactly and how they translate to concrete practices. So there are a lot of issues with consent, right? Users are neither informed nor feel that they have meaningful control over their consent decisions. Practitioners struggle with compliance. When interacting with consent interfaces, we are often faced with lengthy text, legal jargon that we might not always be able to understand. There are questions of how digital literacy issues play a role and how well we're doing in terms of different technical explanations. There are a lot of deceptive designs which have been used in the interfaces for collecting consent. We are overwhelming users with consent decisions, and there is a lot of consent fatigue. There's the question of how vulnerable populations, for example, people who might not be able to make these decisions for themselves, would make decisions in such situations. And in these individualized consent models, what we're failing to account for is the interconnected nature of data, right? We're making decisions about our own data, but in practice, the harms that are generated are often collective and communal in nature. So is there a way to fix consent? This is a recent paper, actually. We have a preprint out, it will be coming out in CHI this year. We propose an alternative that would move beyond these individualized consent models towards models based on collective governance. To understand whether these collective consent models might be effective in fixing consent issues, we can start with the question of what effective consent would even look like. There are some requirements specified by the GDPR. There are some requirements, for example, proposed by the World Economic Forum, and they include dimensions such as freely given. That is, consent needs to be voluntary and given without coercion. It needs to be specific, meaning that we offer users really granular choices. It needs to be informed, so clear information needs to be provided as to what the data is going to be used for. And it has to be unambiguous. So an implementation that allows a really affirmative decision from the user. The World Economic Forum says that consent should involve true user agency. For example, that users could negotiate or opt out and have real control over their data. That consent should be participatory, and we should have diverse stakeholders involved in ideating solutions. And that consent models should offer users real choice, so that services can also be used without consent, and consent can be revoked and adjusted over time. In our paper, we engage in speculative design to make the case for collective consent. So why would we go for collective consent? The first reason is the one I just mentioned, right? Data and harms are often collective in nature, so individual decisions and individual governance might not always be an appropriate framework to govern those. Not everyone can invest time into informed decision-making. When we interact with the consent pop-ups, we rarely read everything that is written there, or we go and make our own research about the company and their practices. And research indeed shows that people can successfully negotiate privacy preferences and decisions together. And in the paper, we try to design a collective consent process using an established practice of citizen assemblies. Citizen assemblies is a democratic process where we randomly select a set of members of a given population who then deliberate on a policy question on behalf of the wider community. And there are several characteristics we would want to aim for when creating a citizen assembly. One is that it should be representative. So we should try to make sure that the demographic makeup of the assembly mirrors the wider population. People as part of the process have to be informed. So the process involves extensive learning and expert consultation. And the process has to be deliberative. So there is a space for discussion, debate, and exchange of views between different participants of the assembly. And there are many, many examples where consent assemblies have been successfully implemented. For example, in Ireland, citizen assemblies deliberated on questions of same-sex marriage, abortion, or gender equality. In France, there was a national citizen assembly that deliberated on problems of climate change. There are various city-level assemblies making decisions, say, about how to make decisions about the budget, city budget and spending. And even tech companies are experimenting with these kinds of models where they've, for example, build alignment assemblies to try to figure out how we could collectively make decisions about how models should be aligned. So how do citizen assemblies work? There are typically 4 stages. The first stage is that we invite and select members of the assembly. So in typical, say, national assemblies, typically 10,000 to 30,000 invitations are being sent out just to select, say, 30 to 200 participants in the end through stratified lottery to ensure demographic representation. And actually in computer science, there is a line of work in computational social choice that, for example, looks at these problems, how we can stratify, how we can design random processes to ensure adequate representation. The second stage is learning and listening. So members of the assembly have the opportunity to learn about the topic through expert sessions, Q&As, stakeholder panels. And depending on the complexity of the question, this typically takes days to months. So for example, an assembly that would try to create recommendations on climate change, of course, it's not something that can be decided on in, say, 1 hour Zoom call, and it takes time. The deliberation stage involves people splitting into smaller groups and then reconvening for plenary sessions. Typically, there are some questions of how these can be mutually facilitated so as not to bias opinions. And so members debate, exchange experiences, and work towards consensus. And finally, after all these stages, some recommendations are being drafted. So for example, we come up with policy recommendations to share with decision makers. And there are different models as to what counts as consensus. Typically, a consensus over 75% is necessary. And summaries of all of these discussions are also made public. And so in our paper, we essentially try to figure out how a process like this could be adapted so that we could have a consent assembly that could make decisions about how data is being used. So for example, when we think about the selection dimension or selection stage, there are lots of questions related to what would count as representation. Do we need to stratify according to the different demographics as is typically being done in consent assemblies? But perhaps we also have to take into account things like privacy preferences or general technology attitudes. We might need to account for populations such as non-technology users who might also be impacted by the outcomes of technology. And we have to take into account how technologies might impact special populations, for example, children, different marginalized groups, or low digital literacy groups. The learning and deliberation stage could be initiated by, say, a company making a request, so that a consent assembly deliberates on a specific governance problem they think about. Right? Can this particular data be used for this particular purpose? Right. The input that might be important for this kind of decision is who is the data controller? So who is the entity that would be processing this? Which sector does the organization? In which sector is this organization located? In which domain do they work? How would they process the data? Are they going to process only certain types of data? Yeah, and the learning phase should involve members from different stakeholder groups, for example, industry, regulators, privacy lawyers, NGOs, and independent experts. And in the deliberation phase, members would negotiate with the company consent terms, meaning the possible outcomes might be accept. And so a consent to a specific type of data use is being granted without any further conditions. It might be rejected. So the assembly decides that certain data use or certain technology practice is not acceptable, and it would have to be reworked and discussed again. Or it can be conditional. For example, there might be some time limits on data processing, or we would say that it's only okay for certain data types, but say not sensitive data types. Maybe the consent assembly would say, we want to make a default recommendation, but in this case, we would want users to have the opportunity to make a final decision for themselves, right? So it creates opt-outs and how these opt-outs could be implemented in practice. And do these collective consent mechanisms satisfy the effective consent criteria I've mentioned? In this case, yes, consent would be freely given because the assembly has the right to reject the proposal. It is specific because through the deliberation, a lot of specific questions could be asked as to how the data is going to be used. It is informed because the deliberation process involves consultations with experts. It does offer true agency because consent assemblies can negotiate the terms or opt out entirely. It is participatory because multiple stakeholders are invited to be part of the process, and it offers a real choice. And in the speculative design process, the final thing we did was backcasting, which is a process where we try to go from an imagined future back to our current reality and try to figure out what it is that we have to do in the here and now to move towards that desired future. And we found that there are certain actions that would have to be taken across different stakeholder domains. So for example, for regulators, finding the right legal framework to make such a solution viable as a replacement for individual consent might be challenging, for example, particularly in the context of personal data protection, which is based on individual human rights frameworks. Companies might need convincing because while on the one hand, the benefit is that the citizen assemblies might simplify the compliance process, perhaps setting the defaults for a range of practices. There are some risks that, of course, an assembly might make a decision that is undesirable by the company. So if we could demonstrate that indeed this process does lead to simplification, businesses could be perhaps convinced. As a society, we would need to shift from viewing privacy as an individual right to a collective good. And this means both epistemically and institutionally. And the question is, how would we set up these consent assemblies? Who should run them? There are some lines of work that indeed point out both the collective nature of data, the collective nature of harms that we experience, but also explicitly saying that privacy is a collective good. So we would need some education to make this perspective accepted more broadly. And finally, when it comes to individual users, how to convince people to delegate some of these individual decisions to consent assemblies, right? Currently, we bear the burden of making individual consent decisions. And here, the idea would be to draw parallels to other domains where we're already comfortable making or delegating our decisions, right? Democracy, representative democracy is one example. Labor unions are another. We could try to build trust through building representative mechanisms by transparency in how these processes are run and by creating meaningful opt-out mechanisms. So that summarizes my talk. We started by investigating the 3C framework, which proposes the principles of consent, credit, and compensation as a guiding framework for generative AI governance. We showed that whether these principles will benefit or harm creators will depend on how exactly they're implemented. In particular, for consent, there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from implementation issues in the context of the GDPR and personal data. And finally, one model that we really believe in is that we can move from individualized consent to collective governance models. And so I'm listing here a bunch of papers that this talk draws on. And most of the work I talked about today was actually led by Lynn Key, who is a PhD student in my group. And Lynn is on the job market looking for postdoc and faculty positions. So if you're hiring, please reach out to her or me so that I can get you in touch. Thank you. Happy to take your
Amazing.
questions.
Thank you so much, Asha. I think that was a really nice and interesting overview of some of the work you've been doing. I'd like to open this up for questions, of course. Feel free to unmute yourselves in case you have any questions that you'd wish to ask Asha. I can get this going with a question of my own, and I'll use the luxury of being the one who's unmuted now to start this off. And maybe with the most recent study that you spoke about first, Asha, I was wondering whether in your work you've also understood or have some insights you could share with us with respect to the harms that consent assemblies could also lead to at the individual level, right? As much as they're motivated by trying to address some of the issues you spoke about with individual consent, I wonder whether consent assemblies could also lead to some different kinds of harm at the individual level.
They definitely can. And I'd mentioned that in certain contexts, it might be useful to draw parallels to democracy. And indeed, right, democracy is not perfect, and there are lots of different ways in which things can go wrong. And I think similarly, things can go wrong with these consent assemblies. So it is possible that the process will be biased one way or another, right? We might have different interest groups, trying to lobby. We might have facilitators who also have their own positions and perhaps try to direct the discussions in one way or another. We might not be able to always ensure equal representation, and so we might skew decisions towards ones that benefit certain populations while harm others. So there are certainly different ways in which individuals might end up getting harmed by the decisions that ultimately end up benefiting the groups they don't belong to.
And in terms of the temporal demands that consent assemblies tend to have, do you see that as factor that sort of limits their applicability in this space? Could you share a little bit about that and maybe your understanding of the breadth with which consent assemblies can solve problems in this space in general?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the most difficult practical questions related to the implementation of assemblies. When we started doing this work, we actually started from this idea that we could just replace consent notices with consent assemblies or different forms of them, and then only later we learned that it's typically a process that takes months, and of course there are different kinds of decisions, different levels of granularity at which we might want to make these decisions, and one way I would think about designing this process is to differentiate between assemblies that have to address high-level big policy questions related to Gen AI and smaller assemblies that perhaps make a decision, on behalf of the citizens of a given city that is related to like a question, can we introduce this new feature to our model, or can we collect this new type of data in the context of this particular system? And so I think with these simpler decisions, it is possible that you would have like a standing assembly that serves for a certain period of time. And whenever there is a question like this of relatively lower granularity or very specific, they just meet for a 1 hour Zoom call to make that decision. But with these bigger questions as to, can we generally use creators' work without consent? This is, of course, a discussion that would have to happen over time with consultations from many people, and the assembly that could take weeks or perhaps months to make that decision. So there will need to be some practical differentiation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Looking around again, just to add more voices to the conversation. Any other questions? Yes, I see Shreya and Leon. Please feel free to go ahead.
You want to go first, Ryan? No? Okay. Thanks, Azia, for your interesting talk. I really appreciate how you make the case for citizen assemblies and collective consent. However, I would very much like to try my hand at the merits currently of the consent mechanism as it has been rolled out by the EU, and see what your thoughts are on that. Comparing the current situation with the consent banners, right, to a situation where it was very much up to the corporation to determine what data they collect and what they do with it. I think one of the merits of the consent, individual consent, is that there is a large authority behind this interest of the individual, right? And this authority is the European Commission. They seek enforcement of this individual right. They see, and it is well positioned against big tech corporations to enforce this. First, right, research this, but then also enforce it. One other dimension I think merits the current situation is that it does raise this awareness. I'm online. This creates data. People have an interest in this data, and I need to be aware that this might have implications for me, for future services, for others like content creators whose content is currently being used. Reflecting on your proposal, I'm curious how you reflect on these merits and what the consequences might be if we shift this for collective consent.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree with you when it comes to the principles. So, of course, if we have an effective individual right, there perhaps is no reason to delegate to a collective. If a mechanism properly raises awareness, then perhaps we shouldn't replace it by something that is happening in the background and perhaps offers less visibility to the users. And so I agree on the principles. The reason why we are thinking about these collective approaches is that so far things don't seem to work in practice. And so unless there is a way for us to implement these things so that the spirit of this principle is also realized, then maybe alternative models could do a better job. For example, when it comes to the interest of the individual, yes, indeed, in theory, we have a choice, but there is a lot of work that shows that sometimes the way the consent banners are implemented are placebo, right? And what is being transmitted in the background actually does not correspond to the decision users make. We are often in a hurry, so we don't actually meaningfully engage with that decision. And it's hard to argue that we are meaningfully exercising our rights. Another example is when it comes to awareness. Indeed, knowing that the company, in theory, that there is a description of what they're doing with the data, right? The research has shown that those descriptions are often very complex, filled with jargon. They maybe don't very explicitly describe what is technically going on with the data. And other research that shows that users rarely actually engage with what is being written or say the extended versions of the consent pop-ups. So yes, if we can make the principles work, that's great. If we cannot make them work this way for a variety of different reasons, from technical to companies not cooperating to users just physically maybe don't having time or not being interested in engaging, then maybe other models could be more effective in practice.
All right. Thank you.
I guess I can go next if there are no questions. I liked the different versions you presented, but one aspect I was still stuck on is the aspect of consent being specific. Like, so yeah, my data being used for specific purposes. But fundamentally, that may have been true like pre-LLM era, but post-LLM era, you had this problem of generalizations, right? So you could technically take a meme to train a large language model, among other things, and it can be used by Pentagon for governance or wars or something like that. So technically, it is like not technically feasible. Like it's impossible to say that, yeah, my data will be used for this purposes because they are essentially used for general purpose machines. So there's this tussle which I always try to understand how would it be solved, because it's literally an insolvable problem. So I was wondering what's your thoughts on that aspect, and also like a follow up to that would be, is it okay if these models, because a lot of the time, like I think people have a misunderstanding because of the past research that was done on AI, where it was coupled with data. So you train on some data and you say, hey, it was trained on this data, so it is biased by the data, and thereby it will produce what the data it was trained on. But there was a strong statistical abstraction that happened post transformer models and LLMs, where it was never a copy paste anymore, but it was capturing some statistical abstractions and presenting it. So it was not a like for like matches, but for similar, right? And thereby you can almost never can say that, okay, exactly it will output the same content that was I gave consent for or did not give consent for. Instead, it's representing a statistical pattern that are perhaps similar but not exactly the same. And so there's also a thing happens where perhaps general public is not understanding how these internal structures work of these different models, and thereby kind of guided by a lot of propaganda to a certain extent, being fearful of what their content is used for. I'm not sure if it's too long, then yeah.
Now, let me start with that second question. Indeed, I think this generates basically a whole new research agenda for how people's preferences could be translated into concrete technical implementations and guardrails. And you talk about the impossibility of making consent about very specific outputs, because the outputs that are generated are likely never going to be exactly the same as what we envision, or maybe the data that we provided. And yes, that is certainly part of it. This also reminds me of one of the participants' quotes, that they would be uncomfortable with their work being used in specific political context, for example, or in context that does not align with your personal values. And this is also something that is really difficult to translate from, say, the principle and the preference to something that can be measured on a level of output, because it will depend on the output, it will depend on the context of the use, it will depend on who is the user generating the output. So how to do that in practice, I think this is a very good question. And I hope there will be more work coming out solving those problems. On that first question, related to the lack of specificity as to what models are being used for, I agree. And this is one of the biggest frustrations I have with how we think about consent and some other regulatory principles, because it seems like training of AI model is considered a purpose. And I don't think this is a purpose, right? Because AI models may be implemented in different domains, used by different people. So the context really matters. And that does have consequences for how we would make our consent decisions. That will have a consequence, for example, on that proposed revision of data protection law, where suddenly legitimate interest can be used to train AI models as if this is just one coherent purpose. So there, I think we should do a better job figuring out how to better describe what we are using data for and what AI models are meant to do and in which context they're being used. So on both questions, I think that there is just a lot to be addressed.
Thank you.
A really nice discussion. And Asha, I don't want to impose more on your time than you have available, but if you do have another minute, I can squeeze in one last question.
Please do.
All right, thank you so much for also being gracious with your time. I was very curious about the 3C framework, particularly because I'm also not very well versed with it, but it resonated quite nicely with some of the thoughts I've been having around end user behavior, particularly from the context of consumers, and whether it's in the context of consumers of generative AI technology or other AI mediated information ecosystems these days. Responsible opinion formation or responsible practices amongst consumers has been something I've been exploring. And I wonder whether you would have any thoughts you could share about how well the 3C framework might fit an exploration of that space. But, although you've been looking at it from the standpoint of how can the framework allow for composing certain institutional mechanisms that can, regulate this space, I wonder what this means for the consumer. And what would it look like if I was a responsible practitioner in the space of providing consent or understanding credit-related attributions in the space of Gen AI? Sorry if it's a very abstract, high-level thing to unpack, but I wonder if you have any immediate thoughts on it.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because the 3C framework, it has been mostly applied in the context of input data. So people who provide data to train AI systems. And now, as I understand your question, you're thinking about end users, so people who consume that information, and whether that framework could somehow still be applicable to govern those interactions. And so, for example, and this is really off the top of my head, when it comes to consumption of content, we might have consent frameworks where we where we permit exposure to certain types of content, but not to others. Now the question is whether, for sure, this can be implemented as an individual decision. And I think those collective aspects will also play a role because of that dimension of opinion formation, right? Individuals, users permitting, for example, being exposed to only certain type of information from, say, one side of political spectrum might mean that as a society, again, we end up in these filter bubbles, or we get polarized in one or the other direction. So I think similar, if we were to apply consent to this end of the pipeline, then I think similar problems would occur. Now, credit, I think credit might play a role for end users if they wanted to, say, be responsible consumers, knowing who are the people who contributed to them benefiting from AI. I can imagine that if, for example, they support online creators through platforms like Patreon and others, if they interact with generative AI creations and they learn that the content, this creator and that creator really contributed to you learning about this topic, then maybe they would want to go and support these creators outside of the platform. And this relates, I guess, to that question of compensation as well, naturally. Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. I haven't thought about that before.
Nice. Okay, yeah, that definitely stirs the pot in terms of good food for thought to continue on. Thank you so much, Asha, for joining us again at the Academic Fringe Festival and sharing a number of inspiring thoughts. I do know, at least within our group, we're going to be talking about some of those ideas in the imminent future. So you have a wonderful evening and welcome. I appreciate everyone else as well who's joined us today and all the others who will circle back to catch this on our webpage later. Do join us for the next Academic Fringe Festival talk. We do have one more to go in this edition. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks again, Asha.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone. Until next time.
Bye.